Okay, so thank you all for joining us for what has been converted to a virtual session. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for your flexibility. Before we get started on introducing today's speaker, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the individuals who made this lecture series possible. So this is the Sheila Hutzler-Reeves Memorial Lecture. And Eleanor Ellie Trowbridge was a member of the Berman Institute at Bioethics Board, for whom palliative care was an issue of great importance. Ellie devoted much of her time to Hopkins as both an employee and a volunteer. She served as Johns Hopkins Development Office and raised critical support for the oncology department. She chaired the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health Council on Population and Family Growth. She served as development consultant for the Children's Defense Fund and Population Health Action International. So in 2003, these tireless efforts on behalf of the university were recognized through a receipt of the university's Heritage Award for Outstanding Service. Ellie's commitments took on deep personal significance with the death of her daughter, Sheila Hutzler-Reeves, who succumbed to breast cancer in 1988. And Ellie served on the board of the Berman Institute until she passed in 2007. So this semi-annual lecture series, which focuses on longstanding and emerging ethical issues in palliative care, would not be possible without Ellie's generosity and that of her family. So we are here today to help realize Ellie's vision and that of this institution to advance palliative care systems and interactions for the benefit of all. So in that spirit, I am pleased to introduce today's speaker, Scott Kim. So Scott is a senior investigator in the Department of Bioethics and studies research ethics, especially the ethics of involving decisionally impaired persons in research, the ethics of high-risk research, and methodological issues in empirical bioethics research. He is also interested in the interface of conceptual and empirical methods of bioethics scholarship. His current research interests involve the assessment of decision-making capacity in persons with psychiatric disorders, the ethics of research involving significant risks, including sham surgery trials and gene transfer, with a focus on the measurement of quality of informed consent, the ethics of comparative effectiveness, randomized trials, and informed consent for open and use of research materials. So prior to joining NIH, Dr. Kim was co-director at the Center for Bioethics and Social Sciences in Medicine at the University of Michigan. His work has been supported by a range of foundations, and he received his PhD in philosophy from the University of Chicago and his MD from Harvard and trained in psychiatry at Mass General. He does note that despite leaving Ann Arbor, he remains a loyal Wolverines fan. As a fellow Big Ten fan, I just won't hold it against you as long as you're not a fan of Ohio State. So with that, Dr. Kim, we'll pass it off to you to share with us your talk today, Assisted Dying in Canada, what everyone may not know but should.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie. And thank you so much for inviting me. And I'm very honored to give this talk. As you know, it couldn't be helped that I had to do this in not in person. So I apologize for that, but I hope we will still have a chance to have some good discussion at the end. All right. Now, is this working?
Yep, it looks good from my end.
Is this do you see the?
We're still seeing, I think, the presenter view, but at least we started to see the slides. There we go.
How's that? Okay,
Perfect.
that's okay, great. So, what I'm going to do is first show you the slide I'm required to show about my conflict and disclosures. I work for the government. So I had to tell you, this is all my personal opinion. And the only conflict I have is that I've done some unpaid expert witness work for the Canadian government. Insofar as I mentioned some of the research we've done, obviously it always involves other people, and these are the folks who have been instrumental. So I want to first start with some definitions. EAS, euthanasia and/or assisted suicide, these are the legal terms in the European countries where this occurs. I like these terms simply because it's very clear that one refers to induced death active termination of life, and the other is somebody receiving assistance in that. The legal term in Canada, which is the topic of my talk, is MAID. So that some people use that as a generic term, but actually it's a origins or as a specific legal term. And I'll use these interchangeably today. And in case you disagree with me or have a bone to pick about terminology, I refer you to a little blog post and I try to explain why I do what I do. Okay, why focus on Canada? Canada actually, it turns out, has the world's largest euthanasia and assisted suicide program. It's actually euthanasia, like 90, high 90s% are all euthanasias. And it is our neighbor, much in the news recently, with important common traits, even though there are some important differences. So there's a lot we can learn from the policy making and practices in Canada on this topic. And the Canadian experience provides important lessons and insights about sort of the generic, what I would call sort of the structure, normative structure of debates over euthanasia and assisted suicide. And I probably won't have a lot of time to talk about that, but I'll try to at least, I prepare a couple slides in which I can gesture toward that at the end. So one more preliminary point I'd like to dwell on before I get to the body of the talk is this. I think it's extremely important to distinguish between a moral analysis versus a policy analysis of this topic. So what do I mean? The moral question is something like this. Can we describe a medical situation in which it is morally acceptable to intentionally end a person's life? So the perspective from which you might think about this is the typical newspaper article about a particular individual and their journey toward why they chose and received euthanasia. So that tends to be very narrowly focused on, is it morally permissible in some cases? The legal and policy question, of course, is much broader. That question is, can we implement a system whose aims are achievable with burdens and risks that are acceptable? Because policies always have trade-offs. So today, and this is important because some people who say yes to the moral question, they think, yeah, it's morally okay, may say no to the second. In fact, I know many people like this, and vice versa, but I'm not going to dwell on that position today. The main point here is that moral question doesn't settle the policy question. And I'm going to focus on the policy question with some evidence and some of the, frankly, concerns I have that I believe should matter to all, regardless of how one thinks about, can I think of a situation where it's morally acceptable? So the outline is I'm going to give a very brief history of the Canadian legal situation and a précis of some key developments, just a few slides. The bulk of the talk will be going through in detail at some points how the Canadian law and practice works the way it does. And then I'll try to briefly discuss some of the implications. So this is the history, brief legal history of the Canadian situation. In 2015, there was a Supreme Court case which overturned the 1990s ruling against assisted suicide, so that the court ruling basically said you can't absolutely prohibit assisted dying. So in response, the parliament made a law, Bill C-14. That law had a provision that only people whose natural death was reasonably foreseeable would qualify. So in some sense, it was end-of-life euthanasia model. That was very quickly challenged, went to court, and a provincial court, not the Supreme Court, is struck down the end-of-life criterion based on concerns about discrimination. The Canadian law, as you will see, is based on justification by the fact of people suffering. And the basic idea roughly is that suffering isn't just limited to end of life. This theme I will return to a couple more times in this talk. So what's a curious thing about that ruling was that even though it was a low-level provincial court that struck down the law, the government that wrote the bill declined to challenge the ruling, de facto making that provincial ruling the law of the land. So, and then they passed a new law in Bill C-7, which didn't have the reasonably foreseeable death requirement. And it also delayed the inclusion of MAID for when mental disorders are so underlying condition. Now that provision has been delayed twice more. Now it's scheduled to go into effect in 27. So just briefly, the sum of this is this. In just a few years from 2015 on, 9 years, 10 years, Canada has gone from an absolute prohibition to a practice that I'm going to spend now quite a bit of time describing. So what are the criteria for being eligible for MAID in Canada? It's what I call a medical suffering as basis. So it looks like this. You have to have a grievous and irremediable medical condition, and it says that it has to be incurable. You have to be in an advanced state of decline, and the suffering has to be intolerable. So if you read just the highlighted, the red letters there, you would think that it would seem that eligibility is fairly restrictive. However, in practice, this is what legally you is allowed. For instance, a person with cancer with a curable cancer greater than 70% curability. I think most people would say that's a very promising curable cancer. But if the person refuses the treatment and asks for MAID instead, they would still be eligible. This is an actual case. Or a person could have cancer, be quite depressed, but cognitively intact and request MAID. And that person could refuse any treatment for their depression, and they could still qualify. Or this is one of the most controversial but common things you read in the newspaper in Canada is that person with a chronic condition that's treatable with standard interventions, and that person would rather live by receiving those standard interventions, but they can't afford it or they have lack access to it. So, and these are kind of things that most other Canadians would have access to. So, so that's, we have to sort of come to terms with how does the law and those eligibility in practice come kind of match. So I'm going to go into that in a little bit. This is a quick synopsis of the progress in just in terms of pure numbers. So in Canada, in 2023, 2 years ago, there were over 15,000 cases. You can see that the cases increase quite a bit year to year. And now it's up to almost 1 in 20 deaths are by euthanasia. If you look at the columns that have RFD and not RFD, those are reasonably foreseeable death. They're called track 1 and 2. And at least the way this is counted, people, overwhelming majority are still with reasonable foreseeable death as their situation when they ask for MAID. However, as you will see, the line between the two isn't as what we might expect. And I'm going to go through that in a little bit. So this is, we need a little bit more data to understand these two columns. In Canada, 1 out of 9 cases of euthanasia are performed by nurse practitioners. I don't think most people know that. And the percent that are found ineligible among requesters is quite low. So you can see it's 2.8% in 2023. If you consider the fact that many of those folks are not eligible because they are too impaired to make decisions at the end of life, the ineligibility rate is quite low. All right. Another set of facts that might be interesting to reflect on is that of the 50,000 plus cases of MAID in 2023, there were about 2,200 unique providers, both doctors and nurse practitioners. In Canada, there are about a little over 100,000 legally qualified doctors and nurse practitioners who technically could provide MAID. So there's about 2,200 people who actually provide it. 361 providers across the entire country account for 66% of the cases. 174 providers account for about half of them. And I thought this was a striking statistic. 89 providers performed over 5,000 cases, over a third. This means that the average provider in this group of 89 provide at least one cases of MAID per week. And this is just on average. So some of them do a lot more, some do fewer, presumably. Okay. Another development, and this is something that's in the news because, and these are folks for whom MAID is more easily accessed than what they perceive to be needed social and healthcare services. So it could be disability services, disability income, treatments, and so forth. So these are the people that whose names you can find publicly from newspapers and so forth. And of these, at the time that the newspaper stories were written, about 15 of them had already received MAID, and 15 had requested, and 7 were considering. Sample quotes of the patients are as follows. They're rather dramatic. People with disabilities have been put on the back burner and nobody gives about them. I'll let you read some of them. On the second column, you'll see I've applied for MAID essentially because of abject poverty. The last quote on the right-hand column summarizes it. I think vulnerable people need help to survive. I could have had more time if I had more help. So this is much in the news, and I just want to make clear these are legally permitted cases of MAID in Canada. And these are the folks, not all, but most of the people who died by MAID under those circumstances. Okay, so I'm going to move on to what I call the marketing versus reality section of understanding Canadian MAID. So we saw that the law seemed quite restrictive in terms of needing to have a certain medical condition that was incurable, quite advanced, and causing unbearable suffering. So how do we put that together, law with what the magnitude of the practice, as well as these kind of somewhat disturbing cases? So in order for me to explain that to you, I need to step back a little bit and think about euthanasia regimes types around the globe. And they roughly fall into 3 types. One is end of life only assisted dying, euthanasia and or assisted suicide. So in the US, it's only assisted suicide, US states. New Zealand and Australian states are also end of life between 6 and 12 months, depending on the disorder and the province. And then you have euthanasia for irremediable medical suffering. Let's just call this medical suffering EAS. And one type is where this irremediability is determined by the doctor, the usual kind of situation in working with the patient. The other is where the irremediability is primarily determined by the patient. Now, I'm going to describe this in further, and that would be Canada. Now, the third type of EAS regime is what I call autonomy only. By that, I mean you only need a competent request to be eligible for assisted death. So this is the case in Germany after a ruling in 2020 by their Supreme or High Federal Constitutional Court. And this is what they say. This is a quote. Right to assisted suicide is not limited to serious or incurable illnesses or certain stages of life or illness, restricting the scope to specific causes or motives is alien to the notion of freedom, which is the thing that's justifying the practice. So, long and the short of it, there's nothing specifically medical about this. If you're competent and you're making an informed request, you are legally eligible to get assisted death. Now, what I'm going to claim and describe to you is the following, that Canadian MAID in practice, let's see, it's not advancing. Oh, here we go. On the surface, looks like a medical suffering-based law, but in reality, it's a de facto autonomy model where the eligibility is defined by the requester's preference, their autonomous request. But it's still labeled as a medical treatment. So you could say autonomy only EAS using the healthcare infrastructure to deliver it. And as I will explain, this has several implications. But first, let me just explain what I mean by autonomy only being delivered through the healthcare system. So you'll recall the law. I'm going to repeat the eligibility criteria, as you can see there. And one objection to what I just said might be, well, that doesn't make any sense because there's this eligibility criteria. So how can it be same as an autonomy only setting? Again, the criterion C, let's start with that. It says that illness, disease, or disability, or the state of decline causes them enduring physical or psychological suffering that's intolerable to them, and that cannot be relieved under conditions that they consider acceptable. So the definition of intolerability or irremediability that's described here is focused on the person deciding. Now, what about you could say, well, suffering that is kind of subjective, people should have a right to sort of define that. So let's now examine more closely the incurability and advanced state of irreversible decline, because those seem to be more medically based. So this is what the Health Canada, which is, Department of Health in Canada, on their website, you'll find a model practice standard. And this is what it says. Incurable means there are no reasonable treatments remaining, where reasonable is determined by the clinician and person together exploring the recognized available. So it has to be available for it to fall under reasonable. Uh, um, and potentially effective treatments in light of the person's overall state of health, beliefs, values, goals, and care. So on the surface, it kind of makes sense because it sounds like what a person finds as a reasonable treatment should include some of those things. However, what this does is the guidance conflates medical incurability with reasons for opting for a treatment. So it defines incurability according to patient preferences and the variability. Now, you might think that's a subtle difference, but think of the consequences of this definition. So if you refuse treatment and die from a curable disease, what is doctor might consider curable, it turns out by this definition that it was an incurable illness that you died from. Or if you and your neighbor have the same cancer, but he lives with treatment, but you died because you couldn't afford that same treatment, only you had an incurable condition. So it's a subtle difference, but it has huge implications. So let's think about advanced state of irreversible decline. That is the capability refers to person's functioning, not the symptom of their condition. Function refers to the ability to undertake those activities that are meaningful to the person. So it emphasizes the patient's perspective. And then, which seems quite reasonable in terms of what is function and meaningful activity. Again, what is a meaningful activity to you should be defined by you, it seems. Now, advanced state of decline means the reduction in function is severe. So there's no definition of severe given here. But since the capability itself is subjectively defined, it's ultimately up to the requester. And then finally, the irreversibility is defined the exact same way we saw in the first incurability criterion. So again, it's reduces down to the person's own perspective. So third criterion I showed you in the eligibility criteria was this, the intolerable suffering criterion. And there we already mentioned that the autonomy point is transparent in the law's text itself. So I'm not going to repeat that. So when you put all this together, virtually any distressing condition could be a grievous and irremediable medical condition, even if the patients refuse effective standard treatments or lack timely access to such resources. And these don't need to be resources that are extraordinary, like let's say experimental treatment or super expensive treatments. These are kind of things that you would expect most people, and indeed most people might already have or in Canada. So this tendency toward expansive interpretations is common in Canadian guidance documents. So for example, in determining what is reasonably foreseeable death. Now, this is still an important criterion because there are different procedural requirements depending on whether the person has a reasonably foreseeable death versus not. The way this is interpreted, when a person has a reasonable foreseeable death, I'm going to read this slowly so you can see what the recommendations from one of the leading advisory groups to the government says. A person can be considered to have a reasonably foreseeable death if they have demonstrated a clear and serious intent to take steps to make their natural death happen sooner, to cause their death to be predictable. Examples might include voluntarily ceasing to eating and drinking. In other words, a provision in the law that sounds like a medical issue, for instance, a person's death being reasonably foreseeable, again, is defined in such a way that a person can actually take steps to make that happen intentionally. As a psychiatrist, I would say one of the things that one might say about that is that a suicidal person could be seen as somebody whose death is reasonably foreseeable by this definition. Okay.
Scott, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. We are getting a pop-up from Microsoft Edge, needs to be updated. Are you able to minimize that just so it doesn't interfere with your slides?
Okay. All right. How's that?
Looks good.
Okay, please interrupt me again if that happens, because for some reason I'm looking at the presentation mode. So if I turn away, I didn't see that. I apologize for that. Okay, so still one might wonder whether I'm kind of exaggerating this, because after all, compared to where autonomous request is the only requirement, in other words, an EAS system that's not built into the healthcare system, you would think that a medically based system requiring grievous and irremediable medical condition would restrict the number of potential requesters. In other words, when you have a Venn diagram of all these criteria, even if they're loosely described, you would think the intersection should be smaller. Well, in practice, there are other things that you have to think about. And here's the following. Whether in autonomy only or medical suffering regime, the pools from which some requests of EAS will come will be similar. Now, why? Because autonomous but happy people don't request euthanasia. It'll come from the following groups. Some people within each of these following groups. Persons already near end of life due to advanced illness, people with severe mental illnesses, or who have limited coping in dealing with these disorders, variety of disorders, such as personality disorders, autism, chronic mood disorders, substance abuse. For this group, there will be a preponderance of women. These are all based on published studies. And chronic disabilities with destabilizing stressors, for example, poverty, mental illness episodes, isolation, or stigma. And elderly people without a terminal illness, but perhaps with multiple conditions that come with age and who feel isolated or just feel that they're tired of their life. So, in fact, the people among people who request, there isn't going to be that big of a difference. However, there's this one important difference is that if this all occurs through the funnel of the medical system, the medical treatment label may actually increase the request because if MAID is seen as a medical treatment option, your doctor might have an obligation to bring it up. In fact, this is the recommendation you find. Um, for example, in Health Canada has another document called Advice to the Profession, and they refer to this document as bringing up MAID as a clinical care option, which uh, says that you may have professional obligation to bring it up with patients. So that's one. The other is that there are other practices that could affect it. For instance, home care coordinating services in a region providing a 24/7 MAID access hotline with a convenient 3-digit number. This is a supported practice. Nursing home brochure. So when you go into a nursing home, they give you a brochure about all the services at and features of the nursing home. Might have a section where they describe MAID and how they can access it. So 3 practical implications of autonomy-only EAS are implication 1, there's a certain lack of transparency. What do I mean? So EAS for medical suffering, especially when it's intolerable and irremediable, as the public understands those terms, has very high support, 73% in Canada. However, euthanasia for pure autonomy reasons, that is, upon request, even in Canada, only a minority of public would endorse this. So another way of putting this might be that the um, appealing to the compassion of the public is something that most people would recognize. Appealing to the inner libertarian of the public is something that's not done very often. So there's a certain lack of transparency. And naturally, you can ask the question, does the public know that the law permits the types of euthanasia that they don't endorse? So I'm going to come back to this point toward the end. Second implication is the following. If you have essentially an autonomy-only euthanasia system that's delivered through the healthcare system as a medical treatment, you end up bypassing important policy debates if compared to if you were just transparently saying, look, we need to have a autonomy-only system and to defend it. If you did that, then you would have to have certain debates, such as if autonomy only, why must it be based within the healthcare system? Or who should pay for it? For example, in Switzerland, where it is not seen as a medical treatment, it's sometimes doctors are involved, but as you know, you may have read in the newspapers that it's mostly done through these volunteer lay person organizations, and people pay for it out of pocket. How much resource should be devoted to euthanasia, to making it accessible in society, if it's compared to how much you should devote to other government services. So you can easily bypass that if you just build it into something that already exists. What safeguards are needed for an autonomy-only system? So you might think that that requires special protections or different kind of protections than if you have a system where, at least on the surface, you can rely on the professionalism of well-trained healthcare providers, for instance. So in effect, there's been a substantial investment to promote euthanasia in Canada as a medical treatment without having the policy debate about priorities if it were seen as an autonomy-only system. Okay, third implication, it has impact on medical practice standards. So I'm going to explain it with 2 examples. One is what we might call kind of loosening or changing of the norms of medical practice. So here's a recent example. This is an actual case. So this person has bipolar disorder that's been difficult to treat in recent years, had lots of medications, abruptly discontinued all medications that she was on, resulting in really distressing side effects. The two specialists that were involved have told her the side effects will subside if she would just follow, the tapering recommendations that they recommended. But she is insistent on seeking MAID for her, quote, somatic adverse reaction to the medication. So adverse reaction is now conceived of as a medical, not a psychiatric basis. So she finds a provider who is willing to provide this after evaluating her without contacting the previous providers or reviewing other records. Now, I point that out is because I think you could reasonably say that is outside the norms of good medical practice. That the person who agreed to do this was a founder and a leader within an organization called KMAP, Canadian Association of MAID Assessors and Providers, which is the most relied upon group by Health Canada, the government, for providing MAID practice guidance. The other is what I call compelled violation of medical judgment as possible. So suppose a doctor wishes not to provide MAID, even if legal to do so because the patient refuses curative treatment. Or maybe this doctor doesn't think lacking access to what is a fairly standard treatment constitutes a medical indication for MAID. The kind of same, uh, um, yes, well, so that's their medical assessment. And assume this doctor otherwise routinely performs MAID. For instance, if a person fails the best indicated treatments, they might agree to MAID. Now, for this doctor who refuses to do these cases, here's what the guidance is. The guidance says the following: conscientious objection may be case specific. Some are consciously opposed to all MAID, some only to certain kinds, and some to only specific instances. However, the same rules apply no matter the scope of the objection. They have to follow the steps laid out in Section 5.2, which says doctors are compelled to refer a patient to another healthcare provider who is willing to provide MAID. So this applies even if the doctor believes that MAID is, in a particular case, medically inappropriate. So what doctor might think, well, look, doing this is sort of like saying if a patient refuses antibiotics for a toe infection and they want an amputation instead, that I have a medical obligation to refer to a doctor who'll do that. And that doctor could say, no, that's just, in my medical judgment, that's not what medicine is. So there is a certain threat of compelled violation of medical judgment because of the way the system works. Okay, quickly, what about communication by public officials in Canada about making this implication of the law clear? So this is what I'm just going to use two quotes. Consider the following statements overmade when mental disorder is the sole underlying medical condition. So there was a recent debate about this because they decided to delay it until 27. And during the debate, this is what some federal ministers said. So Attorney General said the following, that in his opinion, MAID for mental illness would be granted only, quote, where everything has been tried, where the person is an adult capable of making up their own mind and there is no remedy. So I would say that you could interpret that in the somewhat convoluted way that I showed you, but for most of the public, when they hear this, I think they might have a different definition of mind. Same with this other quote from another minister who said that the expansion to people for this practice apply only to those who've been presented treatment after treatment and have tried everything imaginable to address their suffering. Um, so I think the public might be, the legitimate question arises, is the Canadian public aware of and agree to what their law implies? So we actually were curious about this, did a survey, public survey of a couple thousand Canadians, and we came up with four scenarios, two for medical refusal and medical lack of access, and two scenarios for psychiatric treatment refusal, and psychiatric lack of access. So the details aren't important. Those are the categories. And what we found is that fewer than 1/5 of Canadians know that terminal illness is not a requirement for MAID in Canada. And 2/3 think that MAID law applies only to terminal illness. And only a fifth know that patients can refuse effective treatments and still qualify for MAID. So the table here quickly summarizes that. And you'll see also in the very bottom, they were unaware that of the planned expansion to MAID for mental illness as a sole underlying condition either. Now, and then what in terms of the specific scenarios, the first row of numbers shows their response to the question of whether or not does this situation meet the criteria for grievous and irremediable condition, which is the qualifying criterion for MAID in Canada. And you can see that only a minority of people understand that they would indeed qualify. The second row shows whether they would support it. In your opinion, should this patient be able to receive MAID? And you can see for all four of the scenarios, the support is quite low, between 23% and 32%. I show this slide because the first column, you see the column that says MAID in general. This is public's attitude toward just, do you like your law, your MAID law? And that answer, if you're older, wealthier, more educated, less religious, and white, you're going to be more likely to say yes to that. So that's what those positive signs mean. All the zeros and negative signs, you can see on the right four columns for the four scenarios that we tested. That correlation between those 5 traits that predict higher support for MAID in general either doesn't appear or goes in the other direction. I think that's quite interesting. Okay, so the last thing I should say in terms of the my analysis of the current system is that things seem unlikely to change, at least for the near future, because one response to what I believe are some of the concerns that I lay out above could be that MAID should be legal, but it needs to be restricted in eligibility and with more safeguards. However, the trend is actually still continues in the opposite direction to expand MAID for persons with whose sole condition is mental disorder, as I mentioned. That's set to go into practice in 2027. Advanced directive-based euthanasia, which is de facto now what's practiced, at least in Quebec, access to minors and so forth. And one interesting symbol of this might be of the expansion is that there was a committee charged by the government to develop extra safeguards for the mentally ill, if the mental illness was a sole underlying condition for MAID. And the committee reported back saying that they didn't think there needed to be any special safeguards. So I'm going to end this with 2 slides on sort of the implications of all this and what it teaches about the overall normative, what I call the normative structure of the MAID debate, EAS debate. So first is this. All eligibility boundaries can be challenged on equality discrimination grounds. We already saw that Canada went through these boundaries pretty quickly within 10 years. So by that, I mean, by those who feel they should qualify for euthanasia, but feel left out. And conversely, you have people who legally qualify with the disorder, but resent being labeled as having a life not worth living, as expressed by some of those people that I quoted earlier in the talk. And within and across jurisdictions, this is an evident trend. Thus, in the long run, euthanasia regimes will continue to face pressure toward toward autonomy only, where you remove all these specific criteria to remove any appearance of discrimination and simply say, well, if you're an adult, you can request it informed competently, then you can do it. But I will say that it's somewhat ironic that most people, even if they are pro-euthanasia, are not such strong libertarians as to embrace autonomy on EAS, nor are they aware of this pressure within the normative structure of EAS. It's my last slide. I want to just remind the audience that based on some of the things that slides you saw, that euthanasia and assisted suicide policies inevitably raise issues of justice. No doubt that legalizing the practice expands the freedom of some, but not all, but all policies have trade-offs. Broadly speaking, benefit, in other words, people getting what they truly want, and indeed who have genuine options before them. If they get to choose, their freedom is increased. So that benefit accrues to those in positions of relative privilege among people who really can exercise among options. The harm, in other words, feeling forced to choose that or being stigmatized as having lives not worth living, accrues to the less privileged. So therefore, the EAS policy always engages issues of justice. So if you want to read more about this, I have a couple editorials recently that you can look up. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Scott. If you were in the room, you would hear all of us loudly applaud. I know Anna has just put up the request for people to pose your questions in the chat or in the Q&A. While people are getting ready, I will happily take moderator's prerogative. Actually, I will defer to Catherine since we have it here. So Catherine Chung, one of our fantastic PhD students, was wondering how CMAP became so involved in MAID policy in Canada and how you think their conflicts of interest should be addressed.
Oh, there's a long answer to that. And if you want to know the details, you can read the paper that I published recently with my colleagues in A Job, where it, in many words, explains the details of that. So the long and the short of it is that I think, I don't know exactly why the government seems not too concerned about what I think it's, to me, clearly some important conflict of interest where advocacy groups are kind of given tremendous amount of influence in making policy. But the fact is that happened. There was a bit of a vacuum, I guess, or people who were willing to jump into the space of advising the government, and they were sought out. So it's a bit of a long story, and you can read about that. It's in the latest issue or latest announcement of the new articles in A Job.
Great, thank you. So our next question is asking you to speak a bit about the reasons for the delays of implementation of psychiatric MAID and whether you think the reasons for delay suggest it might be delayed again or even repealed.
Oh, I don't know. I don't know what will happen. I think what did happen is the following. The implementation of the current MAID regime, and the folks who really wanted that to happen, activists, various academics, and so forth who were behind that, were very active at the beginning, around the time of the court ruling and so forth, in such a way that it now I've forgotten. My mind is kind of foggy because of my I'm a little sick. So can you just repeat the question?
Yeah, so it's interested about kind of the reason for delays of implementation of psychiatric MAID and whether.
Oh yes, thank you. Oh
Yeah.
yeah, isn't that amazing? Now I'm having a senior moment in public. So reason for delay is because one, there has been a lot more pushback to the implications of what the law actually permits. Because as I pointed out, there's been a mismatch between what the public seems to know and whatever. And as it's been coming out, there's been increasing concerns. So there's actually been a much more balanced public debate of pro-con than it was the case early in the early years, where every newspaper report, analysis, and so forth seemed to be, isn't this a wonderful progressive thing that our country is doing? Lately, it's been, I think rightly so, as you can tell, I'm rather sympathetic to this. I'm very concerned about the justice concerns that their practice allows, because there are really no provisions for ensuring that people who would rather live with standard resources and treatments are given that first. So many people, as you can see, just in the newspapers, we found all those names. So yeah, because that's become more and more in the public discussion, I think the legislators are responding to that.
Wonderful. So we have another question that notes that the U.S. has a supposedly end-of-life only policy. I'm guessing this actually varies by state, but have allowed it for anorexia nervosa. And wanted to know whether you foresee kind of the same issue in Canada, even though MAID for primary psychiatric conditions is not allowed, how this actually works from a policy perspective, and even if it happens in the U.S., where there's an allegedly more restrictive system, kind of why then it's permitted this.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess it falls under the rubric of, you know, um, a policy will have um, how it actually plays out has to do with how you interpret the policy and the implementation regime and so forth. Yes, every state in the US that allows it is a end of life. And there's no requirement for suffering, actually. The US laws are interesting in that it's essentially autonomy, but only at the end of life. So it's kind of an end of life option. So how I think the person is referring to the Colorado practitioner who provided assisted dying to a couple people with anorexia. And you can see, to me, that sort of other people who may not know about that, the same group of people who did that actually published what are called diagnostic criteria for anorexia, terminal anorexia nervosa. And of course, this is another great example of how it sounds medical, but the actual criteria, when you read them, are autonomy based. So it says one of the essential criteria is a person wants, has made a decision of wanting to forgo. And I can't remember the exact wording of it, but essentially it gives they get to decide when they have terminal anorexia. So again, I think we can debate whether it's wise to do X or Y, but I guess what I'm sort of, one of the things I'm trying to point out is it is a little bit worrisome if you try to accomplish it by just relabeling something, because that will lead to avoiding the needed assessments and debates.
Right, so we have lots of questions in the chat. We'll see what we can get through. So our next one notes that it seems the legal framework is grounded on an anthropology of an autonomous person and the role of government in facilitating liberty without any commentary on the ends of a good life. So choosing the circumstances of one's own death seems to be a natural extension of these philosophical considerations. With these presuppositions, the bigger injustice would appear to be restriction of liberty rather than any concern so far cited. So can anyone justify the restriction of EAS in certain circumstances while still relying on these presuppositions? Do these presuppositions themselves need to be re-examined?
I'm not sure if I quite understand the question. My point regarding the Canadian system certainly is that it's supposed to be not a autonomy only system, but it's supposed to be a medical system. So that was the central point of the bulk of my talk. I don't know if the question asked this or not, whether or not there are reasons to oppose an autonomy only system. I don't know if that was correct. If you didn't mean that, I'm sorry. But people ask this question, and this is a really an interesting question. I'm working on trying to understand this very topic. Um, because at bottom, there is a certain priority of autonomy over other values to allow assisted dying. Unless, I mean, the alternative is to say it's the suffering and our desire to show compassion is the real basis, in which case, then you should be willing to countenance things like non-voluntary euthanasia, where a person doesn't have to give consent, um, things like that. So I think for most people, autonomy is an essential ingredient. I would say that that is something the if you posit that, then the nub of the question becomes whose conception of autonomy, how broad a conception of autonomy, because everybody understands that you can't have unfettered autonomy. So what is a legitimate border? Now, as I showed you, the Canadian public, even though they're 70 some percent pro euthanasia to support legalization, presumably part of that is motivated by autonomy consideration. Only a fifth of them think autonomy is a sufficient condition by itself. So I think that in the argument about what kind of autonomy should be the basis for legalizing this, um, what I can say is that for most people, the inner libertarian isn't as strong as some philosophers. I've met plenty of philosophers, of course, who would espouse this, but they are as culturally bound to their views as others, in my opinion. So there it is.
Great. Maybe we'll have a question from Travis be our last one. So he notes he's been worried about the Canadian context as well. And one of the questions he's been wrestling with is if equity arguments push us towards autonomy only views, but those views aren't popular, perhaps we should reject them, which he notes is his own view and perhaps yours. Must we violate equity in order to avoid the push towards autonomy? Or is the equity argument itself mistaken?
I think this is the nub, the central dilemma that we don't talk enough about when we talk about assist dying laws, because I really believe that once you um, override the long-standing prohibition against intentional taking of human life, whatever it is that justifies that is going to be perceived or counted as very strong because the prohibition itself was a very long-held, cherished prohibition. And it's hard to believe that it will not be sufficient to override any artificial, what's perceived as artificial boundaries to the practice of autonomy. Like, oh, it can only happen end of life. It can only happen if you have medical illness and suffering. Well, what about people who don't have medical suffering, other types of suffering? So at the end of the day, I think what you have to do is to have a choice. And this is my personal view. I can't say I can fully defend it, but this is my hunch, is that um, you could have an autonomy only system which will have to countenance the equity issue, I believe. You have to accept the fact that just like anytime you increase autonomy of certain aspect of life, there will be disparities. You know, when you have a full, a while free markets, you're going to have big differences in wealth, let's say. Same thing. Or you could prohibit it, but concentrate on really, really reducing suffering, which you can, I mean, in many instances. I think the toughest situations are people who don't want to continue living, not people who at the end of life want to die a certain way. So those are all open questions that we can still debate about.
Well, I know we're at the top of the hour, so Scott, just want to thank you again for sharing your insights with us, and to you for being flexible, and to our audience as well for the pivot to a different format. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.